with more on the Eagles as they finally get the deal done, Phil. And I wondered yesterday if Jim Schwartz is not the defensive coordinator with this 4-3 scheme that really justifies, he should put up big numbers, which would justify the pay. If he's a 3-4 end, is he getting this same money that he got on Monday?
I don't think so. I think you're right on about that. I think Jim Schwartz ought to get a cut of these guys' contracts. I mean, they pay their agents a percentage, but I think Jim Schwartz is probably I think you're talking about guys like Ndamukong Suh, Marcel Darius. I mean, you're talking about a lot of guys that have gotten a lot of money in the last couple of years, putting up numbers, playing in Jim Schwartz's defense, and then getting paid enormous sums. And Schwartz I'm sure he's doing okay, but he could probably use a little bit of the money that's being generated by his defenses. And that really is the thing. The Eagles, I think there's a double-edged thing going on here. One is Howie Roseman is back in charge, and he gave out contracts to guys that he has drafted. That he was responsible for drafting guys like Vinny Curry, Zach Ertz, Lane Johnson. They were all drafted on Howie Roseman's watch before Chip Kelly took over last year. And Fletcher Cox was probably the best player overall of that group of guys that Roseman drafted. I mean, we're not hearing about Danny Watkins anymore. You hear about Fletcher Cox, first-round pick. They traded up to get him in that draft. It was a good move by all accounts at this point. They got a guy he's only 25 now. He's been in the league for 4 years, but he's only 25 years old. He won't be 26 until December, so he's going to play the whole season basically as a 25-year-old. He's got a lot of football ahead of him. His best years are probably coming up, and he's now being placed into the system that is going to use him in a way that he can really be effective and really be the kind of guy that takes over games. Sue got paid for playing in that system. Cox is getting paid because he's being projected for how he's going to play in that system. So it all worked out really well for Fletcher Cox timing-wise. He's young. His contract is up, and they believe that he's a guy who represents Howie Roseman's best moves as a guy running the personnel department. And this is the guy who has to decide how much to pay him. And to give him a big contract like that is almost kind of a feather in Howie Roseman's cap as well. So I think all that worked out really well for Fletcher Cox in terms of timing and everything coming together.
Yeah, and, it's kind of a vote of confidence for him that we believe that you will be, I always say during the season, Phil, when we're, talking about games and matchups, who on the Eagles' defense is a guy that you need to game plan for? It's like they're saying you have become that guy in our eyes. We believe that the tape shows that a team has to change their game plan around because of you.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mean, we saw glimpses of it. He was not a natural fit in that 3-4 scheme playing as an end under Bill Davis the last few years. And the first year, he didn't have – I think he had like 3 or 3.5 sacks, something like that the first year, and maybe 4 the second year. But last year he was really starting to get the hang of it. In that scheme you're supposed to, kind of play 2 gaps if you're a defensive lineman. So you have a lot of responsibility. You have to kind of be really careful and not let anybody get by you. It's really important to kind of hold your ground, basically, and take on, and try to tie up a couple of blockers. And Cox can do all that because, you have to put 2 guys on him if you're going to try to stop him. But in this scheme, the whole idea of this scheme is just to let those guys go. The guys on the defensive line, they just shoot a gap. They pick a gap, they go, and they try to get through it. And, we have Fletcher Cox as a guy that's very hard to handle, just going full speed, straight ahead at the quarterback on every play. I mean, that can really be productive for the Eagles. But we saw some of it last year, again, in the 3-4, even though it wasn't a natural fit for him, the game he had against the Saints where he had 3 sacks, forced 2 fumbles and recovered them, both off Drew Brees. Game against Buffalo where Rex Ryan said, wow, I laughed at the idea this guy was like Jerome Brown. Now I just saw him play. I'm not laughing anymore. Rex Ryan knows a little bit about Jerome Brown. His dad is the guy that drafted him in Philadelphia a long time ago. And Richie Incognito, who had actually blocked him in that game, basically said, he just tore me up all day. I just had to take my hat off to him. So, we've seen Cox be that guy, and the Eagles believe that he can be that guy, long term. Obviously, they wouldn't have done this contract if they didn't. So it's a really good, combination of timing and everything working out for Cox, of course, but also for the Eagles. If they're right about him, and a lot of signs suggest they are, they have a guy that can really be disruptive and kind of make the whole rest of the defense that much better. Because if you take, when the Eagles had Reggie White, for example, as a guy that could really, dominate and require a couple of blockers to block, it freed up a lot of other guys to get things done. And guys like Clyde Simmons had a lot of sacks. Seth Joyner made a lot of big plays because, offenses are so preoccupied with trying to get where to find a way to stop Reggie White. I'm not sure that Fletcher Cox is quite that level. I mean, Reggie White may be one of the 2 or 3 greatest defensive players of all time, but he's really good, and this is a sign that they are really counting on him to be that kind of a player.
Yeah, Phil, and I guess, for our listeners, as you wrote over at ESPN.com, Phil Sheridan with us, ESPN.com, NFL Nation, the defense that he is now being put in, if you're a casual fan and you're saying, well, Fletcher Cox, 9.5 sacks, 71 tackles, he had a good year, but is he a $100 million player? That position that he played last year is not a position where numbers are supposed to jump out at you. This year, you could see an increase in those numbers, and this is why, because Jim Schwartz's defense is much different than the defense he played the last 2 years with Billy Davis. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I wrote about this the other day, but I was thinking about, Buddy Ryan and all that, because when Ryan got to Philadelphia, he had just coached the Chicago Bears defense to this Super Bowl championship and all that, and carried off the field. And one of the things he told us was that when he was a young assistant coach, well, younger assistant coach, I mean, he wasn't that young, but the younger assistant coach with the New York Jets in the late 60s, early 70s, and Weeb Eubank was the head coach, he just noticed that how much time Eubank spent trying to find ways to protect his quarterback. He would keep the extra guys in the block. He would do all these different things. He would scheme. The whole scheme would be based around keeping the quarterback from getting hit. So Ryan said, hey, if he's so worried about protecting his quarterback, then I should do everything I can to get to the quarterback, to disrupt the quarterback. So that's Buddy Ryan. His defensive coordinator with the Eagles was Jeff Fisher. Fisher became head coach of the Tennessee Titans. His defensive coordinator in Tennessee for a long time was Jim Schwartz. So there's a direct line from Buddy Ryan to Jeff Fisher to Jim Schwartz to back around from the Philadelphia Eagles in the 80s to Philadelphia Eagles today. So that whole idea is just get to the quarterback, disrupt him, make plays, cause him to make mistakes, get pressure, create turnovers that way. So, it's a risky defense in some ways because the defensive line basically just goes. But when the ball snaps, they go. And they go into the backfield, and they go out to the quarterback, or they, if they can get the running back there, if it's a run play, then fine. But the defensive players behind them, especially the linebackers and the safeties, are really on the hook for, kind of cleaning up the mess if somebody gets through that aggressive defensive front. So it's a defense that rewards athleticism and aggressiveness and makes players feel really, like they're empowered to go make plays. But there are, on the back end, what we saw when they ran the wide 9 defensive scheme a couple of years ago when Jim Washburn was here and Juan Castillo was in his unfortunate tenure as defensive coordinator, you saw what happened there where they got a lot of sacks that year. They couldn't stop anybody in the run game. They didn't have the linebackers to do it. So this group of linebackers, Michael Kendricks, Jordan Hicks, Nigel Bradham, the guys that they brought in from Buffalo, that group of guys is going to have a lot of work on their hands to make sure that they don't, let down the side and let guys get through. Because that's what undid them when they tried a defensive scheme like this a few years ago. Kendricks said his responsibility as a linebacker when Jim Washburn was here running the defensive line was like, he had to cover like 4 gaps, where when the linebacker has to cover 2 gaps, that's a lot. When you're asking a guy to cover 4 gaps, that's a lot of room for running backs to get through. So it's a complicated thing, and it'll be interesting to watch it all come together. But if you have a guy that can really make plays and get to the quarterback and be disruptive, like Fletcher Cox, then a lot of that other stuff takes care of itself.
Phil Sheridan, everybody here, ESPN.com, as the Eagles taking a little bit of a hiatus for the next couple of weeks, but they get the deal done with Fletcher, and we do appreciate a couple minutes of you giving us a little insight on the future for Fletcher as he gets the 6-year, $103 million, $63 million guarantee. Thanks, Phil.
Take care, Mike.